And so now,
That's one way of saying it, yeah.
From Ross and McBride, although I don't know about McBride. Jeff Manishen, the superstar lawyer, finally in studio.
There we go.
Pleasure to be here, gentlemen. Long time waiting. Finally here. First time caller, long time
That's
listener.
right.
There you go.
Now on the show. See how easy it is? I mean, most
Nothing to it.
people say, I'm on the show. You want to be on the show? Thanks for calling. Now you're on the show. For people who don't know, because you've been featured on television stations, news, simply because of your expertise, and people say, well, why would someone go to sort of the expert legal advice from a particular individual lawyer? Well, I would suggest when the background and the name Eddie Greenspan comes up, generally that's probably in the very good category. So for people who don't know, and again, you've called in the show for a while, your background exactly is what?
Sure. I went into law school at Osgoode Hall in Toronto in 1972 and graduated in 75. And worked as a summer student for and got to Article 4, Eddie Greenspan. And so I got to see him do a murder trial start to finish, work on a variety of cases with him, developed a great friendship with him, and he literally, Mike, got me my first job. He contacted the director of Crown Attorneys for the province and gave me a really good reference. And that led to my getting a job as a contract Crown working in Hamilton, where I worked starting from 1977. And I was an assistant Crown there from 77 to 85, and then I switched to defense work.
Now, for people trying to put, in perspective an Eddie Greenspan on what he is to this country, what is it in the States? Who is he of a name that we'd know? Because I know for some people it's more television and movie-like, but what is that equivalent? Because is there really anyone equal in what he does in this country?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Certainly in terms of the United States, I mean, historically, we'd go back and we'd say, F. Lee Bailey, somebody like that.
Right.
Somebody who has been well recognized as being a champion of the criminal defense bar. And certainly that's what Eddie was for many years. He passed away 3 years ago. I think it was December the 24th. At the present time, one of his kind of proteges is certainly developing an outstanding reputation, a woman named Marie Hennon. Marie, Article for Eddie, juniored for him, was a partner of his, set up on her own firm. She represented Jian Ghomeshi.
Right, I mean, that was huge.
And Marie is so well respected at a national level and still relatively young. So she's one of the people that comes to mind almost first and foremost as an outstanding criminal lawyer who has got a terrific future ahead of her, recognizing the terrific work she does right now.
Now, you talk about recognized. Are there lawyers, because I think it would take a specific kind of individual who would, I don't know if relish is the word, but lean towards higher profile cases? Does it take a certain kind of person who's okay with the limelight, who's relatively sophisticated when it comes to the media and addressing media? I would think that takes, you talk about Maria, the moment she takes that case, and being a woman, well, we saw what happened. It was a massive media storm. So I would think it takes a special kind of person to do that.
Well, I think the way I'd phrase it, Mike, is most criminal lawyers don't have a chance to have the experience of dealing with the media on an ongoing basis. So much of what happens in the criminal justice system across the country goes on unrecognized. It gets no news coverage. It gets no TV coverage. So from the standpoint of an experience that would be comfortable for a criminal lawyer to be in front of the camera, to deal with the press, it's really very foreign for them. On the other hand, if you get one and you can handle it, then potentially other cases might come to you and you get more used to dealing with the media. I mean, for me, for my background, I've had some fairly high-profile cases.
Yes.
I've had involvement with the media from when I was a kid.
What's the biggest case do you think that people may know or be familiar with in your career?
Wow. Well, years back as a prosecutor, I prosecuted the mayor of Welland for stealing money from bingos. He and a priest were running bingos for charity.
Oh, jeez.
And they were charged with fraud, and he was convicted. I prosecuted a biker who was very high on cocaine, and he shot and killed an 18-year-old young woman and a little boy. And his defense was cocaine-induced psychosis, toxic psychosis. He was insane because of cocaine. He was convicted of second-degree murder. I've done cases certainly in Hamilton that have gotten some coverage. Over the course of time, there was a doctor that I represented some years ago. I've represented different people charged with murder. I've done some special prosecutions involving Toronto police officers, involving a guy who was a lawyer, was involved in the money laundering, a variety of cases. I don't know that I'd say anything that's gotten national attention, but cases that have certainly gotten local and regional, and to some extent some things out of Toronto.
How tough is that when you're defending a possible murder suspect or a guy that's charged with murder, not like because of the personal side of things? Like, do you ever sit there, and I'm not asking you to look into certain cases, but do you ever sit there and go, I clearly know this guy has done this, or I think he has done this, but yet I have to defend? Is that tough to ride that line?
It isn't. It isn't at all. Because when you're going into the job, you realize there's a measure of detachment where you're saying, look, it's a case. And I have a responsibility to do what I have to do to represent the individual.
Detachment's a good way of putting it too.
And loads of cases, Dave, you do know the person's done it. The nature of the evidence is very clear that they've done it, but the issue becomes what was their state, what was the individual's state of mind at the time?
Yes.
Were they acting through provocation, through self-defense? Was it an issue of a psychiatric state? Sometimes, too, when I did one some years back where the major evidence they had against him was a statement that he made, which in turn led him to take him to the gun and the money and so forth, and they had a friend of his who had lent him the gun. Now, this was a bit of a different challenge, Dave, because in that one, there were some very real challenges to the admissibility of the guy's statement. And I got the statement excluded. And I got the gun and the money excluded. And we were into the realm of, what about the civilian witness? And I was going to take the position that potentially they only got him because he'd been made aware my guy was making this confession.
Right.
And if the confession's out, maybe the individual's evidence is out. Ultimately, we resolved it for manslaughter. But that was one that was an interesting challenge because you say, gee, I could wind up with a guy who I certainly know did it.
Yeah.
All the evidence was he did it. But because of legal issues, and they were validly run, there were significant infringements of his rights.
Sure.
He could have wound up walking out the door for a crime that he did commit.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, it's it's interesting that you talk about in defense, and you mentioned the case where it was considered to be narcotically induced. In this day and age, it seems that when there is an issue of fault, and it could be on many levels, and not saying that murder wouldn't be included in that, but with the, I guess, discovery of the human condition respecting depression and mental issue, it just seems like to me at some point that it just immediately becomes a default defense. Societally, just in society, not a legal one. But I'm wondering, in this day and age, are you seeing more and more of that card being played, saying this person was chemically imbalanced at that time, this person wasn't properly medicated, this person was correctly medicated? It just seems like mental issues must play a bigger role, maybe, in the world of legal argument.
Well, I think the way I'd phrase it, Mike, is this: from the standpoint of a defense that the person was not criminally responsible by mental disorder, the burden's on us. On that one, the burden of proof is on the defense to show the person was not criminally responsible. Everyone is presumed to be criminally responsible, so you've got to show it's a disease of the mind that led to the condition. Now, could the disease have been predicated on some form of drug abuse? Sure. I wouldn't say you're seeing a lot of that. Is it relevant on sentence? So it's not so much a matter of the person's ability to know whether what he was doing was wrong or not, which is what you need as the step for a not criminally responsible defense. But abuse of drugs contributes a lot to the commission of offenses, but so does abuse of alcohol. And it's not an excuse. What it becomes is a factor that might explain why somebody did what they did, and you look to try and develop what you can do that the person won't do it again. That becomes an issue on sentencing. How badly do you punish somebody who may well have been in a state where in his or her right mind, fully right mind, non-addicted mind, they wouldn't have committed the offense. But drugs are significant, and one that's a big one is fentanyl. We're seeing widespread use, and you're seeing robberies of pharmacies and other places for fentanyl. Courts are dealing with them very seriously with respect to sentencing. So that's not quite on the issue of the mental state. That's the crime of stealing the fentanyl. But issues of things like drug abuse and so forth, I wouldn't say there's an increased level. I think maybe there can be a heightened awareness. I'll give you another one that I've seen for young people, and I've only become more aware of it in the last, say, few years. Attention deficit disorder.
As a defense? Not
as a defense, because it doesn't affect the state of mind to the point where the person didn't form the intent, but as relevant on sentence, as relevant on coming to understand, and particularly for young people, the instances of it being undiagnosed or not properly treated. And remember that ADHD will lead to impulsive behavior, lead to issues of judgment and self-control. And for young people, if that's not properly addressed, can you see a young person then repeatedly being involved in the criminal justice system because of bad judgment and bad self-control until it's ultimately diagnosed?
Russell's very much like that. I don't know.
I
Russell,
can see it as he sits here.
Russell
I
has
sort of
some
had that
issues.
feeling as I was coming in. I said, I think I see Exhibit A. Get that man some Ritalin. Get that man some Adderall.
Ritalin. Well, I'll tell you.
Yep.
You got a
So
six-pack of that.
That's one that and it's only, I'm speaking as experienced criminal defense lawyer. I've come to learn more about that one in the last number of years and seen instances in which it's been undiagnosed or untreated.
We've seen, changing this into a little bit of sports and what we see, for example, on the ice. And I know this has come into a conversation a number of times in the last 20, 30 years, maybe not so much in the NHL because we don't see the actual fight itself or the stick swinging incident. If I were to go on King Street East here and hit somebody with a hockey stick, I would be charged with some sort of measure of assault, but we don't see that in the NHL. But we have seen that threat that incident could be taken to court. Why haven't we seen anything like that before, and why hasn't it gone to that level?
Oh, gosh, we have seen instances of people being charged. Marty McSorley, for one. We've seen people being charged in NHL
but
hockey
not
games.
to the full extent.
Well, what you've seen, I think, Dave, and there have been others. I mean, there have been a number of other instances over the course of years.
Yeah, Donald Brashear, the helmet.
That's another one. Okay, so what you'll see is charges of assault with a weapon or assault causing bodily harm. The issue becomes a matter of what's the right kind of punishment. And I think to stay with that point, Dave, I don't know that you're going to say we're going to jail a guy for an assault with a weapon or assault bodily harm. Okay, Todd Bertuzzi was another one.
Yes.
All right, with significant consequences because it's within a framework where there's a significant amount of violence that's permitted within the rules, a certain amount of violence that's permitted in the sense of there are penalties for it. Where the criminal justice comes in is where the conduct goes beyond the scope of what could reasonably be expected within the consent level of the game. But now you say, fine, but what's the level of punishment you want to do for that? You wouldn't see the same kind of punishment for somebody who is involved in a game where there's that kind of force, that kind of sanction is distinct from the innocent citizen on the street. Now, would you say it's been adequately punished or not? The idea of jailing somebody for a stick swinging incident, that's a bit of a reach. I don't think realistically we as sports fans or anybody would expect that. But long suspensions, potentially being kicked out of the league, and the criminal conviction,
right.
Those are things that are all significant. We haven't seen as many of those. The stick swingings and things, we don't see that as much anymore.
Well, so you started in 72.
Yeah.
You're
I got my call to the bar in 77, so it's been over 40 years that I've been practicing.
Okay, so was that bragging? I'm sorry, I didn't even ask that question.
Yeah.
But
oh, it's just that's bragging. It ain't bragging if you do it.
No, that's
what
right.
Ali used to say.
That's right.
I've earned these gray hairs, every one of them.
Roy McMurtry, did you ever work with him?
Yeah, actually, he was the Attorney General when I started.
So
and so I've met him a number of times. He's written a book about his life. I would say he's one of the best attorneys general we've ever had.
Well, and what just Dave talked about, we're talking about the mid-'70s, the Philadelphia Flyers, and what was the charge going to be?
Oh, I think there were some assaults and assault bodily harms. And in fact, you will remember too, and I got to this game minutes after it happened, Danny Maloney and Brian Glennie.
Okay.
He hit Glennie, he knocked him out, and then apparently banged his head up and down on the ice. And I was at that game, and I got there about 10 minutes after the fight.
Oh.
Okay, I got there late. Somebody gave me tickets. Somebody said, hey, did you see what happened? I said, what? Glennie just got clobbered by Maloney. I said, what did he get? He said, 5 minutes. I said, he should have got 6 months. Thinking as a criminal lawyer.
Yeah, you're sneaking your card onto the ice.
There we are.
Call me.
Okay.
Call.
It turned out he got charged.
Yeah.
Maloney got charged. A jury acquitted him. But the Philadelphia Flyer prosecutions were under McMurtry's watch, and he thought things were really going overboard. I don't know that it made a big difference because we still did have bench clearing brawls and things for a while. I think it took a culture change over time. I wouldn't call it prosecutions that did it.
The cultural change, I guess, in the area of what do they call them, combative sports and a lot of other issues where it's the issue of concussion, and those athletes have been concussed, and so you're seeing virtually lobby groups. You're seeing, the collective amongst former players and alumni going at leagues and talking about, their I guess, legal responsibility and huge punitive damages. Where do you think this goes? Because we take a look at football each and every week, and every week they implement more and more rules for player safety, but it's also due to the fact I think it's a liability issue. Do you think at some point where you see this going, because the monies are huge, they're just enormous, that sometimes Dave and I talk, and I think, I wonder at some point, do we still see football in the future? Because how do you not? To me, you play the sport because you're wired that way. We want to go out. Dave wants to hit me. I want to hit him. We put on the hard plastic. We go at each other. We know what the sport is because we love it. We love the contact. And then at the end of the day, maybe you only played a year or two, or the average is about 3.5 years in professional sports. I say, how could you not know that was going to be damaging to my brain?
Well, that too is an interesting one, Mike. I think from the standpoint of public interest, there's still a significant entertainment value to things like football and hockey and boxing. I mean,
Yep.
Sports where there's mixed martial arts. I personally don't watch any of that. I have no interest in that stuff because it's such clear, pure violence. There isn't, as far as I'm concerned, a feature of it that I find interesting. But if we went back a couple of notches and we say football, I mean, this has been a terrible year for injuries, and not simply concussions, but a wealth of other injuries too. But the ratings are still up. I think a feature that hasn't got quite the kind of attention and emphasis that I, as a lawyer, look at when I read about and hear about these cases, and I've read a bit about concussions in the United States, is the extent to which it would appear that the NFL was aware of the risk of concussions and hid medical evidence that they were aware of from the players. So to stay with the point you raised, a player is voluntarily engaging in the sport, to some extent, has a responsibility to ensure that the player is aware of the risk he's undertaking. And to me, the core of the claim that the Players Association had against the NFL was that concealment of information which could have been relevant to a given player's decision to play or not. Now, we got a lawsuit going, I think, in the CFL, if I'm not mistaken. And we have a lawsuit NHL. Well, I don't know about what the evidence will be in terms of any concealment by those leagues in relation to information they had on the potential risks of concussion by playing the sport. And that may well be a factor in the way that litigation goes, unless the leagues say, look, we want to settle because we don't want to have all this thing fought out in the public. But to the extent I've been reading and following it, in the NFL, there was concealment. I haven't read or heard anything about that in NHL or CFL, and so we'll see how that litigation plays out. But let's come back to the starting point, which is the player is aware now there's a risk of concussion. And if the player voluntarily plays, sure, the game has a responsibility to make it safe. But to what extent does the player have a consent to participate in the activity? They know the risks.
It as I said, it just, sometimes people look at it and they say, are you serious? You didn't think putting on the helmet, going against a guy who's 295 pounds and he runs the 40 in less than 5 seconds. At some point, I'm sure you realized that this wasn't volleyball. But on the other hand, with the monies that are involved at that level, you've got a CBA coming up. So we know we have football through 2022, 2021 in there somewhere.
Yep.
But DeMaurice Smith, who's the head of the players, so it just looks like there is going to be a war at some point, a lot of issues, and not withholding issues like Zeke Elliott. And him getting a tougher sort of judgment than the law of the land passed out. And I think that's where a lot of this disdain from the Players Association said, well, how can he not have formal charges from the law of the land, and yet the NFL seemed to supersede that. And that, I think, isn't the start of it, but that's a big part of it.
Well, sure. And in fact, in the next CBA, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the whole measure of league discipline is going to be reviewed. I think to some extent we could say that the Players Association gave away the store on that. That in the course of negotiation, to be able to let Goodell be able to impose discipline and effectively sit on appeal of himself.
Yeah.
Well, where is a fair, objective, impartial, and unbiased way to be able to decide such an issue if you consider it important enough, where you feel you're going to get a fair hearing with a proper sanction, with the capacity for review? They gave that one away, but we know historically. A line I sometimes use when somebody says, how long can you hang in and how persistent can you be? I think it was Gene Upshaw with the Players Association strike many years ago. They said, how long can you guys stay out? A day longer than the owners. I use that as a phrase for persistence. And then they folded.
Yeah.
And from the standpoint of league, players' union negotiations over the years, the NFL has, I think, historically been considered to be the weakest. They don't have guaranteed contracts like other leagues do.
Yeah.
And I think it was another example of giving away the store. So I'm sure you're right, Mike. In the next go-around, the issue of league discipline will be certainly a significant factor.
What? We just become best friends? Yep.